Chapter 1. The World in 1945. The guns of the Second World War had barely fallen silent when a new conflict began to take shape. One without the roar of battlefields at first, but with tensions just as deadly. In 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities that had once been cultural jewels were now little more than rubble. Tens of millions were dead. And the two most powerful nations left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union, found themselves looking across a chasm of ideology, ambition, and fear. They had fought as allies against Adolf Hitler's Germany, bound together by the sheer necessity of survival. But their visions for the future could not have been more different. For the United States, victory meant the chance to spread democracy, capitalism, and a vision of free trade across the globe. For the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, it meant ensuring that never again would its borders be threatened by a Western invasion, and that socialism would rise to dominate the world order. At first, the cracks were subtle. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences showed signs of strain, with leaders smiling for the cameras but privately trading sharp words. By the end of 1945, mistrust was no longer a whisper. It was an unspoken reality. Chapter 2. Ideological Clash. The Cold War wasn't just about borders, it was about beliefs. To the Americans, capitalism was the natural path to prosperity. Private property, competition, and open markets were seen as engines of innovation and freedom. To the Soviets, capitalism was a system of exploitation, enriching a few at the expense of the many. Karl Marx's vision of a classless society was the banner the USSR carried. But in reality, Stalin's brand of communism was a centralized authoritarian rule where dissent was crushed, and loyalty to the state was absolute. Propaganda on both sides painted the other as the enemy of humanity. In American schools, children were taught to fear the Red Menace. In the Soviet Union, the West was portrayed as a nest of greedy imperialists. Each saw themselves as the defenders of truth, and the other as the greatest threat to the planet. Chapter 3. The Iron Curtain descends. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited Fulton, Missouri, and delivered a speech that would become one of the defining moments of the Cold War's early years. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declared, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain lay the nations of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, all under heavy Soviet influence. While the West saw this as Soviet expansionism, Stalin argued it was defensive, a buffer zone to protect the USSR from another invasion. The Marshall Plan, announced by the United States in 1947, aimed to rebuild war-torn Europe with billions in aid. But to Stalin, it was nothing less than economic warfare, a bribe to lure Eastern European countries away from socialism. He refused the aid for any nation under Soviet control and tightened his grip on the region. Chapter 4. The Berlin Crisis and Airlift. Berlin became the first major flashpoint of the Cold War. The city, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, had been divided into zones for the Allies. In 1948, angered by Western plans to create a unified West Germany with its own currency, Stalin ordered a blockade of West Berlin. All roads, railways, and waterways were cut off, effectively choking off food and supplies to over 2 million residents. The Western powers faced a choice: withdraw and concede the city or find another way to sustain it. In one of the most remarkable logistical operations in history, the Berlin Airlift began. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering everything from coal to milk, sometimes landing every 45 seconds at Tempelhof Airport. The blockade failed. In May 1949, Stalin lifted it, but the message was clear. Berlin would remain a nerve center of Cold War tensions for decades. Chapter 5. The Nuclear Arms Race. The shadow of the atomic bomb loomed large over the Cold War. The United States had demonstrated its devastating power at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but by 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own nuclear weapon. An arms race was underway, and it escalated with terrifying speed. The US developed the hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviets followed in 1953. Soon, both sides possessed enough nuclear firepower to destroy the world many times over. This doctrine, known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, meant that any full-scale war would be suicidal. The result was a paradox. The more each side armed itself, the less likely it was that either would actually fire the first shot. Yet the threat of annihilation hung over every political decision, every crisis, every confrontation. Chapter 6. The Korean War. The Cold War's first major hot war erupted in 1950 on the Korean Peninsula. After World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel. The North backed by the Soviets, the South supported by the Americans. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops equipped with Soviet tanks crossed into the South. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. Initially, the North swept through much of the South, but a daring amphibious landing at Incheon turned the tide. As UN forces pushed toward the Chinese border, China entered the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River. The conflict seesawed back and forth until 1953, when an armistice was signed, but no peace treaty. The border returned to the 38th parallel, and Korea remained divided. The Korean War set a precedent. The Cold War would be fought indirectly, through proxy wars in distant lands, each side testing the other's resolve without sparking a global nuclear conflict. Chapter 7. The Red Scare and McCarthyism. While tanks rolled in Korea, another battle was being fought within the borders of the United States, a war of suspicion, fear, and paranoia. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw the rise of the Red Scare. Americans worried that communist spies had infiltrated government, media, and even the military. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin claimed to have a list of communists working in the State Department. The number on that list changed frequently, but the accusations triggered a wave of investigations. Hollywood actors, writers, and directors were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Careers were destroyed by mere suspicion. Ordinary citizens were pressured to prove their loyalty. It was a period where fear overshadowed fact, and where the fight against communism sometimes came at the cost of the freedoms America claimed to defend. Chapter 8. The Death of Stalin and New Directions. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. For nearly 3 decades, he had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. His death brought a moment of uncertainty, and the rise of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev's leadership style was very different. He was brash, outspoken, and willing to directly challenge the United States. But he also experimented with a policy of peaceful coexistence, a belief that capitalism and communism could compete without direct war. This did not mean tensions vanished. The world was still divided, but in the mid-1950s there were moments of hope. The Geneva Summit in 1955 saw U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Khrushchev meet, signaling that dialogue was possible, even amid deep mistrust. Chapter 9. The Space Race Begins. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It was a metallic sphere just 23 inches wide, but its beeping radio signal sent shockwaves across the United States. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, they could potentially launch nuclear warheads across continents. The space race had begun, a competition not only for scientific prestige but for military advantage. The U.S. responded by creating NASA in 1958 and pouring resources into science education and technology. The Soviets struck again in 1961 when Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, but the United States would claim the ultimate prize in 1969 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon and Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. The space race was a technological arms race, a stage on which both powers displayed their strength to the entire world. Chapter 10. The Cuban Revolution and a New Front. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. At first, Castro's ideology was unclear, but soon he declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and aligned with the Soviet Union. The United States reacted swiftly. In 1961, a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation failed disastrously, humiliating President John F. Kennedy and pushing Cuba even closer to Moscow. Cuba's strategic position, just 90 miles from Florida, made it a perfect forward base for Soviet influence in the Americas. This set the stage for the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Chapter 11. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. These weapons could reach most of the United States in minutes. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade, calling it a quarantine, to prevent further missile deliveries. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Any miscalculation could have meant catastrophe. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations took place. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would secretly agree to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without bloodshed, but it left a deep mark. Both sides realized how close they had come to mutual destruction. A direct communication line, the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to avoid future misunderstandings. Chapter 12. The Vietnam War. If the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Cold War's most dangerous moment, Vietnam became its longest and most costly. Vietnam had been a French colony until 1954, when communist forces under Ho Chi Minh defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu. The country was divided, North Vietnam under communism, South Vietnam backed by the United States. In the 1960s, the U.S. escalated its involvement, determined to prevent the domino effect, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others in the region would follow. But Vietnam was a quagmire. Guerrilla tactics, dense jungles, and an enemy willing to endure enormous losses made victory elusive. The Tet Offensive of 1968 shocked the American public, showing that the war was far from over. By 1973, the U.S. withdrew. 2 years later, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The war had cost millions of lives and deeply scarred American society. It was a reminder that Cold War conflicts often came at a staggering human price. Chapter 13. Détente and the thaw. By the 1970s, both superpowers were weary. The U.S. faced internal unrest over Vietnam. The Soviet Union struggled with a stagnant economy. This led to a period known as détente, a relaxation of tensions. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Moscow in 1972, signing the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-I, with Leonid Brezhnev. Both sides agreed to limit certain types of nuclear weapons. Détente also opened the door for cooperation in space, culminating in the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz test project, where American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit. For a moment, it seemed the Cold War might be cooling for good. Chapter 14. Afghanistan. The Soviet Vietnam. In 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government facing rebellion. The United States saw an opportunity to bleed its rival and began arming the Afghan Mujahideen, including a young fighter named Osama bin Laden. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, costing the Soviets billions and killing thousands of soldiers. It became their own version of Vietnam, an unwinnable conflict that eroded morale at home and credibility abroad. Chapter 15. The Rise of Reagan and the Second Cold War. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan took a hard line against the Soviet Union, famously calling it the evil empire. He ramped up defense spending, initiated the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile defense plan dubbed Star Wars, and supported anti-communist movements worldwide. At first, this escalated tensions, but it also pressured the Soviet economy, which was already struggling under the weight of military spending and systemic inefficiencies. Chapter 16. Gorbachev and reform. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. Recognizing that the system was unsustainable, he introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He sought to reduce Cold War tensions, signing arms reduction treaties with the U.S. and withdrawing Soviet troops from Afghanistan. But his reforms also loosened the grip of the Communist Party. And once that grip weakened, change spread faster than anyone expected. Chapter 17. The Fall of the Berlin Wall. For decades, the Berlin Wall had stood as the most visible symbol of the Cold War, dividing East and West, communism and capitalism. In 1989, a wave of protests swept through Eastern Europe. One by one, communist governments fell. On November 9, 1989, East German authorities announced that citizens could cross into West Berlin freely. Crowds surged to the wall, tearing it down piece by piece. The images of people dancing atop the crumbling barrier were broadcast around the world, a moment that captured the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Chapter 18. The end of the Cold War. In December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from its ruins. The Cold War, a conflict that had lasted nearly half a century, spanning continents, costing trillions, and bringing the world to the brink of destruction, was over. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, but the legacy of the Cold War, its nuclear arsenals, its proxy conflicts, and its political divisions, would shape global affairs for decades to come.